My name is Molly Riedel. I work in field marketing for Arctic Wolf. I am one of your background hosts today. We're going to give it probably another 30 seconds or so while we let others join, and then we'll kick it off.
Sounds good.
I see Tony already participating in the Q&A box. Feel free to use that throughout the session if you have any questions, or if you're just happy to be here, like Tony. All right.
Pay attention to that Q&A because I'll get sidetracked and we'll never get through this. So.
Absolutely, I can do that. All right, let's get started. So thank you all for joining today. We've got some great content prepared for you. I'd like to introduce our two speakers. We've got Dave Klipp, who is the president and CEO from Adam Creek. And then we've got Nathan Little, who's the vice president of cyber insurance risk and response from Arctic Wolf. And with that, I will kick it over to Nathan to get us started.
Yeah, thanks, Molly, and thanks for everybody for attending. Like Molly said, feel free to throw questions in the chat. We'll try to answer them on the fly or definitely at the end. I think we have some interesting real world cyber attack examples and things that we're going to talk about. So hopefully they inspire some questions. And Dave, thanks for joining as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so like a lot of you are expecting, we're going to cover a few things, and we try to always be very practical. In the incident response world, my background is in actually responding to incidents. I've personally helped victims of incidents through almost 2,000 real world ransomware data breach incidents at this point. I don't do it as much these days, but our team certainly still does. So I wanted to cover the threat landscape and the actual cause of incidents first and foremost. A lot of you have probably heard of how rampant ransomware and data breaches are, and I want to go into a little bit of the true reason why, because I think it's really helpful as you focus on your security preparedness. And then we have a real-life Akira ransomware example. Akira is one of the attack groups. Dave will mostly walk us through that. It's a good example of an incident because the client wasn't properly prepared, so it certainly didn't go as well as it could have for them, which I think there's a lot to learn from through that. And then almost most importantly, as much as we want to prepare to respond to incidents, it's way more important to avoid them altogether, but still prepare in case they happen. So we'll cover some of the most important security controls based on what's causing these incidents so that you know what you need to make sure your organization has in place. So hopefully it'll be helpful. All right, so to set the stage a little bit, this is from, it's a rolling yearly database for the most part. So this is a breakdown of the most common types of incidents that any and all organizations are falling victim to. It really, 10 years ago, it used to matter a lot what industry you were in, and what industry you're in, healthcare, finance, was really indicative of how likely you were to experience a cyber attack. It's not really that indicative anymore. All organizations are targeted. A lot of the reason for that is because of how rampant ransomware attacks are. Almost all of you know, but a ransomware attack is where an attacker gains access to your network remotely. They're not in your building. They're somewhere, usually across the world. And they encrypt all of your data and they steal a little bit of data. And what they do is they've locked you out from doing business. They destroy backups, they encrypt all of your systems, and literally no one can do any work. And then they also steal a little bit of data, and they say that if you don't pay us, we're not going to unlock your network, and we're going to release this data publicly. And I'll actually show in a little bit what that looks like on their their website that they maintain. So those types of incidents, those extortion-based incidents, are responsible for nearly half, a little over 44% of all of the incidents that we respond to as an incident response team at Arctic Wolf. So very rampant. All organizations are targets. You'll see the attackers target what we call kind of the low-hanging fruit of organizations that don't have proper authentication controls, organizations that maybe don't have good software update practices and patch management. And that's why any organization is a potential victim. The next biggest section is, and they're close, network and host intrusion. That's just more traditional network compromises that we get tagged into before the attacker has accomplished their goals. So either internal IT teams or security providers or the Adam Creek team through their monitoring notices that there's an attack attempt in progress and tags in the incident response team to kick the attacker out of the network and kind of fight back keyboard to keyboard. And then the third, also very common, business email compromise. As boring as that sometimes sounds, it's still one of the most common attacks in the world. Attackers know that if they can spy on email traffic, they can steal sensitive data. And most commonly and most importantly to them, they can jump in the middle of payments. Typically when you're paying large invoices, large wire transfers, we've had incidents where attackers will redirect $7 million wire transfers by just jumping in the middle of email traffic and hiding certain emails. They're very good at it. They're very creative. And it's easy to avoid most of the time, but sometimes it's pretty convincing. So those types of incidents are pretty common as well.
Nathan, do you mind if I just add a little context to that last slide?
Go ahead.
As a personal, a battle I fought in the years I've owned Adam Creek and been a managed security provider is it's been scary the number of times customers have said to me, or potential customers have said, why would they want my data? My data is not worth anything. It's very easy to say, if I follow that up with asking simply, is your data not worth anything to you? If I take possession of your data and no longer allow you to access it, how long do you stay in business? And that usually changes the conversation because people have to realize that if the data is worth something to them, it's worth something to someone nefarious trying to compromise that data. And I'm seeing a huge amount of increase in the business email compromise as well. A colleague in a peer group called me. We're not a customer. Turns out might be a customer in the future, but they lost just north of $500,000 to an email compromise where money was wired out of their organization. Some people didn't follow some process and procedure, which does happen. But at the end of it, more than $500,000 in loss, which was not all covered by their cyber insurance company. So
yeah, it's so common. And I think you're spot on with the comment of the value of the data. And with ransomware, it's not even so much focused around the data, it's focused on the value of the operation of the organization. Like I work a lot with our insurance carrier partners, and we talk about, okay, what is the possible loss, financial loss of a ransomware incident? Well, with how digitally focused organizations are these days, in theory, the possible loss is the entire value of the organization. Like there are organizations, many, the majority, where if you lost access to all of your backups, all of your IT systems, all of your data, you wouldn't be able to recover. You wouldn't be able to survive if a ransom wasn't able to be paid and the attacker's decryption program didn't work. And our incident response team is very good. So fortunately, that's very rare. But we've had, I can think of 4 incidents specifically where victims were completely shut down by ransomware. Their backups were encrypted, and the attacker that left the ransom note, for whatever reason, they just disappeared entirely. Sometimes it's because of a law enforcement action. Sometimes it's because they get spooked and go into hiding. Sometimes they get shut down for whatever reason. and there was just no way to recover the data in the systems, and the companies already weren't doing the best financially, and they just had to shut down. So it can be very severe. I won't go into every section of this slide, but this is the data. We call it the root cause data. How did the attackers gain access to the network? And the reason I show this is because at the end of the presentation, I will show my recommendations for most important security controls to avoid these incidents. So the reason I show this slide is because when I talk about the security controls, you will see, and I'll talk about them, how they literally just remove entire segments of this pie chart so that it prevents the attackers from being able to access the network. Essentially, like, you can think of all the security frameworks in the world, all the concepts, but for the most part, proactive security is about avoiding the start of it. It's not entirely this, but the start of it is about avoiding these root cause situations. Don't let the attacker in the front door. And it's a helpful way to look at it. So the left side pie chart there is for the ransomware and network intrusion cases, and the right side is for the email compromise cases. We split out the root cause because they're very different attacks. They're very different attack patterns, so it's helpful to look at them separate. And what I want to call out for everybody is the two biggest sections on the left side there, most of the orange section. The biggest one is external remote access. That literally means the attackers are just misusing the legitimate remote access method of the company. Like, they're just logging right in, walking through with either credentials that they purchased on the dark web, or they're just guessing a bunch of credentials to get in. They just walk right in. There's no fancy attack method. It's really incredibly simple. And it's the most common attack method because it's the easiest for them, and it's working a lot for them so that they have no incentive to work harder. The next section is, I'd argue it's even easier for them, but it's just, there's not as many potential attack victims. That's the known vulnerability section, the section there that's a little over 30%. That means there's a vulnerability out there in an existing piece of technology, either a firewall or a server of some sort. I won't go into all the details of vulnerabilities, and Dave, I'll kick it to you in a second if you want to weigh in. But this is something that should have been patched and fixed, but it wasn't because maybe the organization didn't know about it, maybe the patch wasn't applied correctly, and the attacker just uses a little snippet of attack code that can walk right in through that vulnerability on the perimeter of the network. Dave, any thoughts on these? Anything you want to highlight?
I think you've done a really good job, but I want to caution people it's something you can't allow yourself to get overwhelmed. You have to take, a best practice and just minimize to the greatest extent you can the area, the attack surface. What are the likely areas they're going to get in? Let's address those first and foremost, and always continue to get better. That's the biggest thing. I always talk to every single client that we sit down quarterly with and go through their security posture is, this is a journey, and it's maybe the never-ending journey as the landscape will continue to evolve and change. But just address as many of many of these issues as you can, and the new ones that come up, and just always strive to get better.
Definitely. And it's a really good approach, because like the approach you just outlined, if we applied it to these two pie charts here, the two biggest sections are external remote access, and then on the BEC side is phishing. Well, the solution to both of those, the biggest two sections of each type of incident, is proper phishing resistant, kind of like leading multi-factor authentication, even like a biometric authentication, which is even easier for users than traditional MFA, nearly eliminates both those entire sections. So that is just one goal that you could approach to start that makes a gigantic impact on total risk. And then once you tackle that is the no-brainer one to tackle first, for the most part. Then you can move on to what I'd argue is the next most important, equally important, would be external vulnerability scanning and patch management, which nearly knocks out to 100% certainty the known vulnerability section. And then you're really just left with the two smaller section of each pie charts, and in a few quick, relatively affordable projects compared to the large scheme of IT, you're in a much better spot.
Absolutely.
Here's just I wanted to illustrate how pretty much every, on the left side here, the y-axis of this chart, those are the industries that we track. It pretty much runs the gamut. Every organization from nonprofit to online retail to the energy segment are experiencing ransomware incidents, and really the ransom demands are less focused on industry. This chart is representing how much the attackers demand to unlock the network. Hopefully it's something victims never have to pay. If you have good backups, you're very unlikely to need to pay. There's a few unique situations. But the attackers, the two biggest factors on how much is demanded is the attack group that attacks you. Some attack groups, their standard ransom demand is 3 million, regardless of type of organization, regardless of size. Other attack groups, their starting demand is 50,000. So attack group is the most significant factor because they all have different strategies that they go after. And it typically correlates to what country they're out of, because cost of living actually in that country impacts how much they demand. And then the other factor, slightly less important, but still pretty important, is the revenue of your organization or the perceived size of your organization. Those are the two most significant factors that the attackers take into account when they're setting their initial ransom demand. And they'll usually, we can usually see it pretty plain as day. They'll look at typically publicly available revenue information. So they'll just Google, like, what's the revenue of this organization? And we've had clients that have had significantly less revenue in practice than what Google or whatever Zoom Info says that they have, and then the attackers demand just astronomical amounts. So it's really not rocket science for them, but it can be significant amounts of money, which is why preparing, preventing, and then even thirdly, cyber insurance is so important to help organizations recover from these incidents.
Nathan, I got maybe a quick question for you, because I think I have seen, I don't know that I have, a beautiful pie chart or image to share, but I have seen at least perceived an increase in attacks. Well, clearly an increase in attacks is easy to say, but particularly in organizations that would, I think, historically be less prepared for those attacks, in that they know some of the healthcare and financial services, and those are having some compliance regulations imposed on them or pushing them in that direction that minimize how the organization might not be as vulnerable as some of the retail or some of these other places that are not as sophisticated technology wise. Do you have any kind of thoughts around that idea?
Definitely. I think you're spot on that is happening, and that's why organizations that are traditionally not considered targets as much are more common victims. And I think it's for two reasons. I think one is a little bit of just the low-hanging fruit situation that I talked about. The organizations that are less prepared are less likely to have good MFA and less likely to have patch management. So when these attack groups are just executing their programmatic scripts to find victims, these organizations that are less prepared are the low-hanging fruit. It's the first ones they'll run into. Like, there's very few healthcare organizations in the world that don't have some sort of vulnerability scanning and patch management because it's required. Now, we still run into issues, but for the most part, they have it. So that is definitely happening, like more of less cause and effect, and just kind of like what the attackers do is exposing the weakest victims who are the least prepared. The other thing, though, is there's two broad categories of preparedness. The first is preventing the attacker from getting in the network in the first place. And then the second is on the detection once the attacker is inside of the network. It's on the backup and disaster recovery planning. And the attackers know that once they're inside of the network, within about 24 to 48 hours, they need to find all of the critical systems on the network. They need to find where the backups are stored, gain access, and delete them. So if I'm an attacker and I'm looking at two potential victims, and one is a hospital and the other is a major construction firm, well, I'm going to know from experience that that construction firm has likely invested less in backup and disaster recovery. So they're, if I have to pick one person to attack that week, they are more likely to lead to financial gain for the attacker because they're less likely to have good backups that they can restore from quickly. Maybe they don't have any backups that can survive the attack at all, which means they're likely to need to pay some sort of ransom. These attack groups, they operate in their eyes like very legitimate businesses, and in kind of their distorted view, they actually consider what they do like pen testing and then charging retroactively via the ransom after the fact. So like any other business, their time is limited, and they pick the victims that they are most likely to think will lead towards financial gain for themselves. So I think for those two reasons, the low-hanging fruit and then the attacker is when deciding between two perceived as equal potential financial gains, they're going to focus on the one that's less likely to be prepared. And even furthermore, they might compromise both. They might get inside of the VPN, the remote access for both organizations, and they might do a quick network map. And if one organization has really good network segmentation and the only thing the attacker can see is like 400 laptops that are being used to do work, and they can't see any servers, they can't see domain controllers, they can't see backups. But then in the other one, the construction in this particular example, they do a network scan. They're like, oh, there's their backup server, and there's the 6 other critical SQL servers. I'm going to focus on this one. It seems like an easier victim to handle. So good segue into a real world example and kind of what can go wrong for the most part, but there are a little some things in this example that do go really right. And Dave, in a couple of slides, I'll let you set the stage even more. But Dave and I picked this very specific example because it was an organization that Adam Creek really helped out on and saved the day for, but the organization hadn't prepared ahead of time. It was a very messy response. They didn't really know what they were going to do. They weren't prepared to prevent or respond to an incident, and they still ended up okay, but it was a very painful process. I think it's just more informative to go through this type of incident than one that goes perfectly. There's just more to talk about. So this is the one I mentioned at the start. It was an Akira ransomware incident. Akira, as an attack group, they've been around since 2023. They're pretty active. They love accessing networks through vulnerable VPNs or VPNs without multi-factor authentication. So that would be a category of the remote access root cause that we talked about earlier. And you'll see it's not formatted well and it's not perfect English, but on that screenshot there below where it says Akira, they say, well, you are here. And I'll change the wording a little bit to reflect what they actually intended. It means that you experienced an unscheduled forced pen test, and for a fair price, we will make it all go away. Basically, they've attacked and pen tested successfully your network, and now you need to pay to unlock systems and prevent a data leakage. So the attack occurred, real world example, in June 15th. All IT systems were down. The network was inaccessible remotely or on-prem. Pretty bad situation. The primary backups were encrypted as well. And the ransom demand was, I believe, about 1.5 million. Pretty standard situation for Akira victims. Thousands of victims a year for this group. I also wanted to show, before we go into the example, because most people haven't seen this. So this is a real screenshot that I just took just the other day. You can see it's current to March 14th on the left side there where it shows the dates. these are real victim names. A lot of times we'll black these out. I intentionally didn't black them out because I think it loses a lot of its value in the presentation. But this is what the group does if a ransom is not paid. They will post the victim's name to their website. Now, these websites are pretty regularly accessible, and it will become public knowledge and public information. So they first list the victim, and then they say, if you read some of these, they're a little bit hard to read. But they'll say sometimes, oh, we have 12 gigabytes of essential patient information that was stolen, and it's compressed, and it compiles of 1 million patient social security numbers. So they'll lead into and threaten the data they have to try and put more pressure, create news stories and put more pressure on the victim, either through their employees or through consumers or through regulatory agencies to try and get paid. And then if organizations don't pay, they will post this follow-up. This is one where the attacker posts an actual download link for the stolen data. So this is where anybody and everybody, typically other nefarious groups, or sometimes the media and different reporters, will download this data. They'll review what's compromised, and they'll do other things to try and monetize this data. So that's what we mean. Not only do they go into the network and they encrypt and lock everything out, so you either have to restore from backups or hopefully not, but maybe pay a ransom. They also threaten this data extortion motion where they're like, well, you had backups, but if you don't pay, we're still going to leak this data publicly. Now, we never recommend paying for just the protection of data, because once the data leaves the network, there's no guarantee it's deleted. We have a lot of different philosophies. Every situation is different. I could talk about it for days. But I just like to show kind of what this group does in addition to locking up all of the systems. Dave, any thoughts on the Akira group before we jump into the incident timeline?
I have plenty of thoughts about the Akira group, most of which are not suitable for broadcast publicly. But yes, they're not friendly. I'll tell you that. So
yeah, none of the groups are, and you definitely don't want to deal with any of them. Certainly not when the situation goes something like this real one that I know you experienced.
Yeah, I'll set the stage a little bit, or add to what Nathan had provided. This is a very real world that took hundreds of hours to recover and put this customer back into business. We had been engaged by this customer 6-8 months before the attack to do an assessment. Bottom line is, we have a very process-driven assessment methodology, and they were in compliance with 8 or 9% of our compliance assessment. So we'll say there was plenty of opportunity for improvement. This customer had 150 to 200 employees, a fairly sophisticated environment, but an example of of an environment that really needed some proper, a lot. They needed, they were in need of a lot, and it had been kind of forsaken for a while. As I said, we had given them assessment. We had helped them try to put together some plans for hadn't and things, and it just hadn't never gotten approved. And so the kind of the high level timeline is we got a call from the customer on the 15th as they were starting to experience firewall issues. They were experiencing access issues. They asked us if we had a password to their firewall from when we had done the assessment months before. They were, quickly being locked out of their entire system. We did end up eventually, probably weeks later, it was discovered that the Akira group had gained access via a VPN to an outdated Cisco firewall. that did not enforce MFA in any way, shape, or form. It was likely credentials that were compromised and being sold on the dark web. You guys got to realize that this is an economy. It's an economy in its own self. There's several different ideas or scopes about how big the economy is, but they all start with a B and have more commas than I'll see in my bank account. And it is treated in such. It's an economy. Basically, on the 15th, they started having problems. Coincidentally, I was getting on a flight coming home from a project, and they kind of assured us they thought they had control. They were moving forward. We didn't hear from them until Monday, the 19th, and I believe Monday. We heard from them, I believe, on the 19th, at which point it was the entire scope of the issue was divulged to us, where they had actually been contacted by CISA and had been advised that their entire Active Directory credentials for every person, every user, everything was for sale out there on the dark web, and that they had then kind of started the incident response, which meant them trying to figure out, do they have cybersecurity insurance? If they did, who can they work with? Who they call? They have to get a contract established for them to start doing the work. And it wasn't until late on the 19th that they had actually jumped through those hoops. So the attackers had 4 days at least. And Nathan might be able to add to this a bit, that especially in an unsophisticated environment, one that doesn't have a proper detection and response platform such as Arctic Wolf, it's not uncommon for us to see threat actors in a network for days, weeks, sometimes months. By doing that, they can make sure that all of your backups are encrypted and really leave you up the proverbial creek. So I'll fast forward a little bit. We jumped into action. We put proper firewall in place. We started locking down the network, taking things offline, trying to figure out what was offline and how it was offline. It took us about 18 hours of digging to finally get access to the root of the VMware data store, in which it's actually at that location where we found the files encrypted at the data store level. And one of our favorite things to find was that they had actually encrypted all of the Veeam backups for their entire VMware infrastructure. So this meant that their entire data infrastructure had been compromised. They had even changed credentials on all the switching, the firewalls. They had even changed the credentials on the Veeam on the Nimble storage array. So it was, they had really put this customer over a barrel. As said, a couple days later is actually when the incident response team, quote unquote, arrived. They came on site. I say quote unquote because that was the response team that was hired by the insurance agency or insurance company. And at that point, we had decided as a group, with their executive leadership and our team, that if we were going to continue to manage this incident, we would be taking lead on it, and we would be leading the incident response, and the other team brought in would be leading the forensic assessment of the situation. Ended up working out well because they were able to focus on that. We were able to focus on how we were going to rebuild and attempt to recover this environment. You might be asking how we were going to even attempt to recover. It was nothing more than pure luck that we were able to recover any sort of data for this customer. As I mentioned, we were pretty concerned about their state of affairs months prior to this. And one of them was that they were storing their data protection, their Veeam backups on the same storage array as their production. That's a no-no. They were storing it in a in a immutable, so not in a non-immutable. It's a hard word. You have to look it up, but they were not segregated backups. There were no offsite backups. There were no air-gapped backups. Thus, they were fully their production backups were waiting and available for encryption. Back in February of that year, this all happened in June. We had put on site a demo appliance to show them what a proper backup strategy should be in a data protection. And we had done that mostly because, frankly, I was starting to lose sleep over this environment. They were supposed to make a decision. It was supposed to be a 30-day evaluation. Well, June 19th, they still had this device on premise. And thank goodness, because we had that demo appliance on site is the only reason they were able to get back any data without paying ransom. You can see through the timeline, it took many hours, I think I provided Nathan, but it was in the hundreds of hours of Adam Creek restoring service, working over weeks. And it wasn't until mid to late summer that everything was actually fully restored for this customer. It was a very methodical process to bring things back up and build the environment, not, from the ground up, leveraging best practices, implementing the proper security posture, network segregation, proper firewalling, all the good, proper, best practices that need to be applied. That's a huge impact, was a huge impact to the organization. I mentioned that this customer because of the backups, did not have to pay for pay ransomware. That makes it sound better. What they ended up having to do, because all of those records, and they were personally identifiable information, they were sensitive records that they had stored for thousands and thousands of people. They ended up having to, because those records were exposed and compromised, they ended up having to pay what I'm sure is a large amount of money for credit monitoring and restoration services if needed for everyone that was exposed. So that was a real hard cost. And to be fact, I am still having to occasionally take calls with their vendors and partners to reassure or to provide documentation and of how they have changed their security posture, because it had a massive impact on their credibility in the world. Their partners were exposed. Heck, my data had been exposed by part of this. So I look at those as really significant costs that can and should have been avoided.
Yeah, absolutely. So this wasn't a case where Arctic Wolf incident response was involved, but a few things I just want to draw people's attention to. You are spot on with the overall cost. I mean, 45 days of at least either full or partial downtime, and that is a significant loss in revenue or funding, or however an organization survives. That is a tremendous loss of well over 10% of their yearly revenue is typically what we'd see in that time frame, because some is recoverable. And then the data breach costs, whether it's class action lawsuits in the future, credit monitoring, even data mining to figure out whose information was compromised, all of those expenses are tremendous. Now, fortunately, this victim did have cyber insurance. You can see in the bottom left there, they did make a cyber insurance claim. And at Arctic Wolf, we are big. We obviously don't sell cyber insurance, but we're big supporters of cyber insurance. We've seen it save countless companies. So this organization likely had cyber insurance cover at least some of those costs. But I suspect, I don't have any intimate knowledge of the full costs or the insurance coverage here. They likely maxed out their policy between the business interruption and the data breach, and they likely had some pretty significant out of pocket costs as well. Cyber insurance limits are designed to cover bad situations that shouldn't happen, but when they go reasonably well and are prepared for, and that's why insurance will typically require that you have an incident response plan. I think if this organization would have planned better ahead of time, one, I think this incident was very avoidable, but two, I think if they would have planned the disaster recovery and the incident response process ahead of time, the damage, both financial, technically, data-wise, could have been a lot less. The other thing I'll call out, in that bottom left box, there was a weird gap, and I obviously was not involved, and Dave wasn't involved because it was all in insurance hands. It's very abnormal for it to take 6 days to truly start the incident response process. Even working with insurance, insurance has gotten very good lately, and sometimes it's a few hours to start the incident response process. And good insurance approved IR firms like Arctic Wolf Incident Response, we're going to start remotely. We're going to have the attack contained within a few hours after being engaged, and it's going to go very well. Something happened in the planning or the insurance process where this organization wasn't prepared, and something strange caused that 6-day delay. I just want to be clear that is not the common experience with insurance, and certainly not if you prepare ahead of time.
100% agree with you, Nathan. I think, well, I don't think it's 100% accurate that they had no incident response plan. They had no disaster recovery plan. The IT, team, the management team, the executive team had no idea actually who their insurance carrier was, what the process looked like, what the contractual, obligations are. A contract had to be executed. They wanted to get their legal involved in that. Like they just had not done any of the pre-work that should be done ahead, so that if there's response, you can call the fire department right now before, the figurative fire department right now, and they'll respond, as opposed to, figuring out who, where, when, and how you're going to respond.
Yep. Yeah. And there's like a real piece of practical advice. There's really easy ways to accomplish that. If you have cyber insurance, you should work through Adam Creek and your broker to make sure that you work with your broker to have somebody like Arctic Wolf, who will work side by side with Adam Creek seamlessly as your pre-selected response provider. We're approved by all of the insurance carriers. It doesn't mean that it's guaranteed that your insurance carrier will pick us. We're typically on a panel of 3 to 10 providers for each insurance carrier. So it's free and easy to work through your broker to pre-select us and to make sure we work with Adam Creek ahead of time. That's like the easy kind of minimum thing that everybody should do, is make sure that you know the incident response firm that will respond. Similarly, you can work with your broker to pre-select a law firm as well. That's even better. If you want to be more advanced about it, you can work with Adam Creek to do a true incident response plan, preparedness, disaster recovery package. That's obviously tremendously important, so that you don't have 45 days of downtime like this sample incident. So those are real actionable things that you can do, like working with Adam Creek and your broker, just to make sure you know the parties will respond. That's typically a half day of effort on the broker side. Dave, and I know you can speak to that more. I want our audience to know that, yes, there's ideal ways to do this that people should do, but I think the problem with this organization, we'll go into some other problems, is they just kind of did nothing for preparedness. So they were just too in the dark, unfortunately, when they started.
They honestly had to figure it all out, and that's not the way you want to be. As an example, Adam Creek as an organization, because we have our compliance requirements and our security requirements, and candidly, a 45-day period would be what I call a resume generating event for me, and no one wants that. Like that would easily put Adam Creek out of business, and we would all be looking for new opportunities. So you got to plan ahead, and Adam Creek does a full incident response, tabletop exercise to make sure everyone knows where, how, when. We do that twice a year. So those are things you should consider. Maybe twice a year is a little frequent for you, but if you're doing it regularly, it's not as much of an investment.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So to recap, this real situation that we just went over the timeline of, obviously it's not even worst case scenario, because in the end they were still able to recover. So surprisingly, we see a lot of situations that are worse, and the victim organizations has to pay a ransom because they weren't lucky enough to have the Adam Creek immutable demo backups still in place. But I wanted to pick out a few things like, okay, what really went wrong here if we kind of look start to finish for the most part. The client had a pretty outdated Cisco VPN that didn't have multi-factor authentication. So these Cisco VPNs, and this isn't specific to Cisco. A lot of different VPN providers have different vulnerabilities that have happened. So I'm not saying Cisco's bad technology. It might not be what I would pick, but it can work well in certain situations. But Cisco had a vulnerability actually in 2020 with their firewalls that Akira was well known to target. And then there was some subsequent vulnerabilities, like actual issues that then were patched and updated. But Akira targeted them, and other groups targeted them to steal these credentials and then resell. So when we get a call for a victim that has an Akira incident, and they say, oh, we have a Cisco firewall, like, we immediately know the vulnerability that was likely involved. And that's true for almost any attack group. We know their tendencies. So not upgrading or keeping their VPN up to date and not having multi-factor authentication, that here is the specific thing that let the attacker in the door. So if they wouldn't have had that, if they would have worked with Adam Creek or anybody to upgrade this technology and secure authentication, this attack wouldn't have happened. So that's not to say other attacks through malicious emails or other things could have happened, but this specific attack wouldn't happen. Then if we go to number 2 there, if they would have had some really good network segmentation in place, the attacker would have gotten into the VPN, but they wouldn't have been able to see anything sensitive. They wouldn't have been able to access that domain controller and dump all the credentials, which is what CISA ultimately found in some way, shape, or form and notified this victim about. But then that's also what the attacker used to access Veeam backups, to access the VMware infrastructure. They just had the keys to the kingdom. And that's for a lot of reasons. I could probably add about 10 more things that likely weren't in place there. But network segmentation is probably the biggest one. Attackers should not be able to log into your VPN, your remote access, and from anywhere in the world and see super sensitive systems. Those should be behind a couple of other layers of technology walls, essentially. So then third, after the attack occurred, lack of incident response and a recovery plan, certainly probably the most damaging after attack problem that occurred. This organization just wasn't prepared to respond, restore, recover. That's what created the 45 days of downtime, the additional business interruption expense. That's I think where things really went wrong. If this organization would have had a really good disaster recovery plan, really good response plan, they had some good technology in place, like that data store that they had in place could be used in different ways. They probably could have restored in 48 or 72 hours, maybe a week if things really didn't go well. They should, with proper planning and disaster recovery preparedness, like tabletop exercises and backups through Adam Creek, I'm confident that this organization could have restored in a few days. We even see organizations that properly repair and can restore in a few hours. And that's pretty advanced. Typical best case scenario ransomware recovery time, because of cleaning the network and other things that have to occur, and we'll see this in a quick example I go through, it is 48 to 72 hours. That's like if it's a standard organization, well prepared, immutable backups without total failover systems, can usually things will go smoothly and recover over a weekend, essentially, because a lot of these attacks happen on Fridays.
Or Mondays. Holiday Mondays are a big one.
Yeah, holiday Monday's a big one too. It not a lot of Tuesday Wednesday attacks. It's
No.
it's Mondays or Thursday Fridays seem to be, for a variety of reasons, common. Similarly, they didn't have a pre-picked incident response firm. They had no incident response plan with a firm in place ahead of time. And then they didn't have an endpoint detection and response tool. So that's a traditional like EDR, kind of the next generation of antivirus that could have detected the attacker's action, could have detected that credential dumping, and with proper monitoring, which is the next one, could have intervened. And then in any organization, no matter how well prepared and how great your IT systems are, unfortunately, in today's security landscape, you can have all security tools in the world, and if nobody's monitoring them in a 24/7 basis, like Arctic Wolf's managed detection and response offering, these tools can be firing all sorts of alerts and blocking all sorts of things. But if nobody's responding and truly kicking the attacker out of the network, eventually, not always, but the attackers can get past the tools. Dave, anything I missed here, or anything you want to expand on?
No, I think you nailed it all.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to answer one of the Q&A questions quick, because I think it's timely. How do you balance the efficiency of incident response automation with the need for nuanced human judgments? What measures can organizations take to mitigate vulnerabilities that might arise from over-reliance on technology? So I think there's a few different parts of this question. In the incident response process, we use a lot of automation tools. AI is certainly becoming very commonly used to help improve the speed at which our team can respond. And I think if you're in a true attack situation, like there's an attacker in the network, the balance is, let's get this attacker out of the network. Let's do whatever it takes. Let's segment certain parts of the network. Let's shut down systems, knowing that it may cause temporary business interruptions. But let's act very heavy-handed to avoid weeks of possible damage. So we kind of quarantine and ask questions later. Now, every situation's a little bit different. Energy segments where the damage of taking certain systems offline can just be tremendous. Our team obviously acts a little bit differently. Hospitals can be a little bit different depending on the status of patient care. Every situation is a little bit different. And then what measures can organizations take to mitigate vulnerabilities that might arise from over-resilience on technology? I love this question, and I think I understand it correctly. For example, in 2020, when the world went into quarantine and everybody worked remote, VPNs became incredibly common for remote access because people needed to work from home. So what happened was everybody turned on legacy VPNs, firewalls that they hadn't patched in 4 years to allow for remote access because they had to, because they were dependent on that technology to operate business. But they were forced to do it quickly when one day you were working from the office, the next you were working from home, and by that Monday, the IT teams were instructed to allow everybody remote access. What this created was the most vulnerable set of companies the world has probably ever had. And 2020 is when ransomware attacks really went rampant. They nearly tripled from the year before. And it was simply because of VPNs. And VPNs are great. They're technology that organizations should use, but they should use it correctly. So I think to prevent incidents from over-reliance on technology is the technology you need to use needs to be modern. It needs to be managed properly. It needs to be authenticated properly. Authentication and vulnerability scanning probably being the two biggest. Everything you use should be authenticated properly with multi-factor authentication and secure, trusted identity management, and it should be monitored for any vulnerabilities that exist and then patched. The other thing to limit exposure is as few of systems and technologies as possible should be accessed from the outside world directly. So web servers and other things. If everything's behind your virtual private network as designed, it's still security in depth. You need to focus on everything, but at least you're focusing on less points of, it's like having less doors that you could leave unlocked in your house. You're focused on the security of your front door, and then the interior doors are slightly less important, but still important.
I think really focusing on that vulnerability management is a huge, VPN is the biggest one by that pie chart, but it's pretty simple to solve, with modern VPN or SASE, any of these types of modern remote access, because let's be honest, not everyone's going back to the office 100% of the time. And so we need to adapt, and we need to give people a secure way to do their business, their work from wherever they happen to be, and put some guardrails around that. I'm not going to allow you to log in if you happen to go to Russia on vacation. Not sure that anyone's going to Russia on vacation. That might cause a whole lot of other problems with your passport, but we're not going, we're going to be logical and common sense about where and when we're going to allow access from, doing things like not only username, password, and MFA. We have taken it to almost all of our clients. Like, we want to know exactly, is this machine that you're coming in on, is it part of the domain? Is it secure? Does it have all of our tool set on it? If not, maybe you just get web access to things, or maybe you get kicked out and said, no, you can't log in from your kid's laptop using the VPN. So it's I hate to use the zero trust, but it's like we're pretty much not trusting anyone or anything anymore. We're verifying and validating, and vulnerability management is huge. You got to be, I think applying patches once a month is so 1999. I think you need to be pushing, applying security patches on a weekly basis at the minimum, because there's too many, concerns out there, and you really should be maintaining and monitoring those and know exactly where you are from a stamp, on your environment. And then we are also proponents of at least all of our managed service customers get at least a annual internal and external penetration test to simulate a what an attacker would do and what they would have access to, and how we can address those or minimize, again, that exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we only have a couple of minutes. There's a couple of additional questions I'll try to touch on. I'm going to skip over a few things and really skip to the end, where we have our most important security recommendations that people can screenshot.
I believe we will be sending out some of the content to the attendees. I can't remember. Sorry.
I think we will. We'll have some things to follow up on. I don't think we can share every detail of the deck, especially the screenshots of the attacker's website, but we can definitely follow up with the materials. But I wanted to make sure we touched on this one. This is kind of a summation of all of the recommendations we had. Real true, great security recommendations. The minimum side, it's a recap of everything that we've covered kind of throughout. You led into it perfectly with your last statement about the external vulnerability scanning and patch management. I completely agree. The best thing to do is assume attackers, the millions of attackers in the world, and their tens of millions or billions of attack tools, programs that are consistently running, they will find unpatched vulnerabilities immediately. So not only do you need to patch them, you typically need to check if they've been exploited, because it's nearly instant once what's called a proof of concept, which is how the attackers actually exploit a vulnerability that exists. It's nearly instant that things get exploited these days. It's so rampant. Then secure remote access, endpoint detection and response tools to protect the endpoints and the programs that are run on it. Phishing resistant MFA for email, and really any other cloud system, email just being the most vulnerable because it's targeted so much. An email filter to reduce the amount of emails, malicious emails that actually hit people's mailboxes. Network segmentation, incredibly important. Immutable backups, maybe the most important, because it's kind of the end all fail safe. At least if you have truly immutable backups, you will always be able to recover no matter how long it takes. And then user security awareness training. So those are the true minimums. On the ideal side are things that every single organization should have as well. An incident response plan. Arctic Wolf has one, and Adam Creek can build around this. The Arctic Wolf Jumpstart plan, but definitely work with Adam Creek for all your incident response planning needs, and they'll tag in the Arctic Wolf team as needed. And then 24/7 monitoring. This attack world evolves so quickly. You really have to have somebody that's monitoring 24/7, and then doing penetration testing to make sure that you're essentially simulating attacks on yourself before the attackers can, and making sure that you find any gaps exist. So I know we weren't great on our timing, and we went a little bit over. Dave, any last comments or remarks?
No, I think this was good. I do apologize for being a little wordy, but I think it was good content. If you have any questions, want to discuss, the fun, exciting world of incident response and cybersecurity, please feel free to contact us, and we will continue the conversation.